Ki tifka shor oyivka o hamarot to'eh hashev tishivenu lo. If you happen to see your enemy's cow or donkey running loose, take it back to him.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emat v'chayei olam natav otoshenu Baruch atah Adonai notain haTorah.
Okay, and now our third pair consists of Hershel ben Yaakov and Benjamin ben Hershel. Going first? You go first? Baruch Adonai Habarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Ki tifka, ki tir'eh hamor sona aha rovetz tachat masa'o vehadalta me'azov lo, azov ta'azov imo. If his donkey has fallen under its load, help him get the donkey back to its feet again. Don't just walk off.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah amet. V'cheinu olam natei b'techenu Baruch atah Adonai notain haTorah.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and finally, our Bar Mitzvah himself.
Baruch et Adonai HaMevorach.
Baruch Adonai Habarach Le'olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Le'olam Va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bahar banu mikol ha'amim v'na'atan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai notain haTorah.
Amen.
Lo tir'eh mishpat evyoncha berivo. Midvar sheket tirhak venaki ve'tzadik al taharog ki lo atzdik rasha. Do not deny justice to a poor man when he appears in court. Do not make false accusations, and do not put an innocent person to death, for I will commend anyone who does such an evil thing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torat emet v'hayei olam nata b'tochenu Baruch atah Adonai notain haTorah.
Amen.
Our service continues on page 19. The weekly reading of a portion of the Torah was instituted by Ezra in order to advance the congregation's knowledge of the 5 books of Moses. But what about the rest of the Bible? The rabbis 200 or 300 years later added an additional reading called in Hebrew the Haftorah, which is selected from the prophets or the other biblical writings so that the congregation would become familiar with the teachings of all parts of the Bible. This week's Haftorah is from the book of Kings, chapter 3. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar bin ve'im tovim v'ratza v'divrehem hane'emarim ba'emet. Baruch atah Adonai habocher batorah uv Moshe avdo uv Yisrael amo unvin vie ha'emet vatzedek. Blessed is the Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has chosen faithful prophets to speak words of truth. Blessed is the Lord for the revelation of the Torah, for Moses his servant and Israel his people, and for the prophets of truth and righteousness. We read responsively paragraph by paragraph. There were 2 women who were harlots, came before the king, and one woman said, "Oh, my lord, and I, this woman, live in one house. I gave birth to a child, and 3 days later she also gave birth to a child. Her child died, and during the night she took my son and laid her dead child in my arms.
When I awoke the next morning to breastfeed my baby, I knew it was dead. When I looked very closely at this child, I knew he was not mine." The other woman said to the king, "No, the living child is mine." Both women argued before the king, saying the child was theirs.
After listening to the arguments of both women, the king said, "Fetch me a sword." They brought a sword before the king, who said, "Divide the child in 2. Give half to one and half to the other." Then said the woman whose living child was held by the king, "Oh, my lord, give her the child and in no way kill it." The other woman said, "It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it."
The king answered, looking at the real mother, "Give her the living child, and do not kill it, for she is his natural mother." All of Israel heard of the king's judgment, and they feared him, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. He was King Solomon.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Sur kol ha'olamim sadiq b'chol hadorot ha'el ha'ne'emam ha'omer. Uv Moshe av ha'amdaber chayim shekol divarav emet vatzedek. Al taharag va'al ta'avodah va'al ha'nevi'im va'al yom ha'shabbat hazeh shenatantan lanu Adonai Eloheinu anachnu modim lach. Varchim otaf yit barach shimcha b'fi kol hai. Tamid le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh ha'shabbat. For the Torah, for the privilege of worship, for the prophets, and for the Sabbath day, give us for sanctification and rest, for honor and for glory. Let us thank and bless the Lord our God.
We read responsively on page 22. When Torah entered the world, freedom entered it. The whole Torah exists only to establish peace. This is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Those who study Torah are the true guardians of civilization. Let us learn in order to teach. Let us learn in order to do. And let us rise as we return the Torah to the ark.
It's time he, la
Dear parents, family, and friends, as you know by now, the tradition of this ceremony occurs when a Jewish boy of 13 assumes the responsibility of manhood. I realize that it takes more than a bar mitzvah to become a man. It will take the experience of living and loving, getting along with people in our society, and learning from my mistakes to become a mature individual. My Torah portion teaches us to be tolerant and understanding of your fellow man and to follow the rules and laws of our society. Rabbi Maller and members of your staff, thank you for all your hard work and patience with me. As you know, most people become bored with long speeches, so I would like to extend my thanks to all of you for being a part of this wonderful day in my life. I do want to give a special thanks to my mother for all she had to put up with to get this point in my life and this wonderful affair together. Thanks.
Becoming a bar mitzvah is more than simply reaching the age of 13. Everybody reaches the age of 13 as long as you don't play on the freeway. Becoming a bar mitzvah means accepting a certain responsibility and a challenge. It means spending years going to Hebrew school and religious school. It means learning Hebrew. It means knowing that someday you will stand up in front of a congregation filled with your family and friends and accept the responsibility for leading that congregation. It's a little bit scary, somewhat daunting, and it must be faced and the challenge accepted if one is to become a bar mitzvah. Mark has done that, and he's done that well. And I'm proud of him, as I imagine all of you are. And so I would like to call him now before the ark for my blessing. Usually we learn from the Torah, Shabbat, from the tradition and the wisdom of our ancestors. But there are times when we can also learn from our own generation, from the things that are happening in our own days. And so I'd like to share with you my thoughts about something that's been happening over the course of the last few weeks or months in our country. The United States has been involved in an investigation of what is sometimes called the Iran scam, the decision to trade arms for refugees, to give in, you might say, to a principle that we had said we opposed. And during the course of this investigation, it turns out that Israel has been involved as an ally of the United States in the Middle East, indeed, involved in suggesting the arrangements. It would have been easy, and many politicians would probably have preferred, to simply blame it on the Israelis. Why not use a scapegoat? Politicians are very good at that. You shift the blame to someone else. Well, they suggested it was all their idea. We just kind of were led astray by this whole thing. And although there were one or two who kind of sounded like that, the majority of them were wise enough to say, listen, we make our own decisions. They made a suggestion. We decided to follow up on it. We got carried away with it. Whatever responsibility is, it's our responsibility. That's because Israel is an ally. One tries to blame things on one's enemies, not on one's allies. You need one's allies. Indeed, it's important to understand that Israel is an ally. And like any relationship between two allies, it doesn't mean that you always agree, that your interests are always the same, or your perspectives are always identical. There have been disagreements on numerous occasions, even outright conflicts sometimes. For example, if you remember back in 1967, the Israelis attacked an American spy ship in the Mediterranean during the middle of the Six-Day War. An accident that they said had happened because it was not identified, since it was pretending to be a merchant. If you remember, on a political basis, the Israeli government very much opposed the American government's sale of AWACS planes to Saudi Arabia, the F-15s. One they were able to stop, the other they were not. Both cases, the American government had to sort of make a compromise, and the Israeli government had to make a compromise. And in both cases, although there was a lot of opposition, and some people were afraid that because of that opposition there would be some kind of attack on Israel or on Jews or anti-Semitism, there wasn't. Once the situation was over, the battle was over, things quieted down and moved on to something else. Now, it's important to bear this in mind because Jews tend to be very, very sensitive. Whenever they see some kind of a conflict, it's sort of like a kid seeing a conflict between your mother and your father. And you don't want to see either side win, and you don't want to see either side lose, and you just wish they wouldn't argue so much. So we have that same kind of a thing, but we have to bear in mind that in politics, there are frequently disagreements. Think for a moment about something that we're not so emotionally involved with. Take the relationship between the United States and France. Again, two countries that are basically allied with each other. Nevertheless, lots of differences and conflicts over the course of the years. When the French were involved in Algeria, trying to maintain it as a colony, the United States was opposed to that. When the United States was involved in Vietnam, the French were opposed to that. The French have on several occasions released terrorists. Indeed, it's quite possible that the government wanted the present terrorist who was just tried and who was guilty for killing an American diplomat, an American military officer, to have been let go with an easy sentence because they were worried about what the terrorists would do. We intervened to push for a tough sentence. Again, there was a conflict. On the reverse side of it, the American government was critical of the French when they were going to be involved in building a pipeline in the Soviet Union, yet they went ahead and did it. The point is that, again, allies sometimes disagree. It doesn't mean the end of the world or the end of the alliance. In spite of everything that I said, something did happen that many Jews, I guess, I don't know how many Jews, some Jews at least, in the deep recesses of their hearts would have feared would be the worst thing that could happen. An American Jew was accused and indeed confessed to being a spy for Israel. Some Jews have always been worried that they would be charged with dual loyalties, that they would be charged with being more loyal to Israel than to America. Anti-Semites frequently make that charge. And although Jews know it's not true, they're worried. And here was a case that seemed to prove that it was true. I actually think it proved the opposite. What it proved is that very few people in this country are anti-Semitic. Oh, had this happened in Europe, had this happened in the old days in Europe, sure, it would have been like the Dreyfus trial. Sure, there would have been much anti-Semitism, because the anti-Semites are always looking for something.
There are perhaps 5 or 10% of the people in our country that have anti-Semitic ideas or attitudes or whatnot, and they probably will say things like that. But the overwhelming majority of Americans do not think that all the Jews are disloyal because one Jew becomes a spy, any more than they think that all the Catholics are disloyal because some Catholics have been spies, or all the Protestants are disloyal because some Protestants have been spied, or all the blacks. There was a Chinese guy just last year who was in the CIA for 20 years and it turns out was handing over information to the Chinese. Most Americans know better than to say or do those kind of things. They understand that individuals are individuals. Indeed, as one thinks about what has happened in our country politically over the last 20 years or so, what I am struck by is the absence of anti-Semitism. The numerous occasions where, in Europe of 50 years ago, there would have been a major anti-Semitic policy, program, political movement pushing this kind of a thing, but here it didn't exist, except on the lunatic fringe. Let me give you some examples, because it's easier to remember what happens than what doesn't happen. But what doesn't happen sometimes is just as important, if not more important, than what does happen. Do you remember when Henry Kissinger became the American Secretary of State? Many, many Jews were very proud. It was the first time there was a Jewish Secretary of State. A lot of Jews began to worry, especially when Kissinger and Nixon began to arrange the withdrawal from Vietnam. And I heard people tell me, you know what's going to happen? We're going to withdraw from Vietnam, the South is going to fall, and then everybody's going to blame Kissinger and the Jews. They'll say the Jews sold us out, the Jews stabbed us in the back and pulled out. That's what happened in Germany after World War I. They blamed it on the Jews. Well, we pulled out of Vietnam, the South fell, and nobody blamed the loss of Vietnam on the Jews. How about the Arab oil boycott? Here, long lines of people waiting at the gas stations. I heard people tell me if there's one thing Americans don't like, it's waiting in line, being inconvenient. They're going to blame it on somebody. They're going to blame it on Israel. They're going to blame it on the Jews. But when the polls were published, people were interviewed, they blamed it. They blamed it on the Arabs, the logical people to blame it on. They blamed it on the oil companies. Something like 4% blamed it on the Jews, our residual group of anti-Semites who always want to blame everything on the Jews. There have been other instances where there could have been, if one was so inclined, a scapegoating of Jews, and there has not been. All of this says to me that America is not Europe of 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. America is not like Germany or Poland or Russia. We fortunately did not have a medieval period of anti-Semitism. We did not have centuries of periods when people were indoctrinated with anti-Semitic ideology that was just laying there under the surface and people ready to take advantage of it. We were spared that, and we have something that they never had. We have a Constitution. A Constitution born in freedom, which celebrates its 200th anniversary this year. A Constitution which the majority of people in America, even if they don't understand exactly everything that's in it, understand protects our basic freedoms and our responsibilities. Perhaps, from the Jewish point of view, there can be no better celebration of the strength of that Constitution and the success of our American democracy than to look at what has happened and to realize what has not happened. Jews, I believe, can trust in America and in its future. Americans have earned that trust. We need to support, of course, the Constitution and all the forces that work for it, because we know that there are always people who are willing to cut corners, willing to see something in their light and their advantage. But there is no doubt in my mind that 200 years of that Constitution have brought forth a new people, the majority of whom understand how to judge and to judge fairly. As you heard in the Torah portion, one must not be a slanderer. One must not accuse everyone for the sin of one or of two. One must know to distinguish. One must treat people as they ought to be treated. All of this influence of our Torah, I believe, is also found in our Constitution. Let this 200th year, then, of our Constitution be celebrated by us especially, because we Jews in America are blessed to live in a country in which, if such a thing happened in Russia Poland, in other countries, there would be a very, very different reaction. Let us not take it for granted. Let us always appreciate what we have in this country. We continue now in our service as we turn to page 23, and I ask you to rise for the Aleinu. Standing as we continue on page 24. We pause for a moment to remember those who have preceded us in this life and who continue to live in our hearts and in our minds. No one ever dies unless they're forgotten. As long as you're remembered, you remain alive. And so we remember, and because we remember, and we are fortunate to have people to remember who gave to us and shared for us, cared for us, and loved us, and inspired us, and taught us, we recite the Kaddish. Let us join together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei ra, let's begin again. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah B'alma di v'ra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael b'agala uv'izman kariv v'yimaru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah v'vorach la'olam u'la'almei amaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar, v'yitaleh, v'yithalal, shemei dekudashah, v'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran bi'alma, v'yimaru, Amen. Yehei shalomo rabba min shemaya v'chaim, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'yimaru, Amen. Oseh shalom v'imromav, uyaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'yimaru, Amen. Please be seated. I'd like to call upon one of the members of our Temple's Board of Trustees, Mary Nachman, to come up and to make a special presentation to Mark of his certificate and of a gift from the sisterhood.